And so this was designed to test some of the predictions out of each of these. Basically, the motivation impairment effect, many of you are probably quite familiar with it, is derived from a hypothesis advanced by DePaulo. Excuse me. And she proposes that highly motivated deceivers are going to be more detectable through nonverbal channels because presumably their nonverbal behaviors are going to be impaired, but they will be less detectable through verbal ones. And their belief here is that motivation facilitates the verbal performance. It's a dual hypothesis. Many people who report about this miss that entirely, that it is a dual hypothesis. Many of them ignore the fact that you have to also look at modality. So this study really was trying to look specifically at the effects of modality on detection, since the MIE is primarily concerned with the detection side. But because it assumes that part of it has to do with the performance of the sender, we thought it quite important to look at what the sender also does. So the contrast here is from interpersonal deception theory. This is just going to be a fragment of that theory. But we're of the belief as communication people that motivation can often have a facilitative effect on both verbal and nonverbal. But at a certain level, you can hit the choking under pressure effect, and you can have both be impaired. And you can have differences depending on how much you are affected cognitively and in terms of memory access, arousal and emotion, behavioral control, and the theory, rather than viewing the deceivers as passive individuals, operates on the assumption that deceivers are also engaging in strategic activity to modulate their behavior, control their behavior, and put forward a credible performance. And that means also that they're going to make some dynamic adjustments over time. While we're interested also in how modality affects accuracy judgments, part of what goes on with accuracy is a function of what the sender does and not the modality. So that'll factor into the design. Since you'll all be having access to the slides, I've listed a number of the publications where this is being discussed. So we started out with a pilot test with 30 subjects. We then did a main experiment with 186 subjects. We had trained interviewers. They were trained by, for those of you who know him, Pete Blair. He served as one of our interviewers. Pete has done a lot of the training for Reed and Associates. And then we also followed up with an observer study where observers viewed the various interviews. Basically, the design is this. Students come to a classroom, and in that classroom, we have left a wallet to be stolen. Some people are randomly assigned to the theft condition. Others are randomly assigned to the truth condition. All they know is that they're supposed to be present in class on that given day. For high motivation, we offered people additional monies, $50 as a bonus, if they could be convincing enough to get through the process and be designated as truthful and credible. The truthful people had the same incentive. They were supposed to be judged as truthful and credible. The low incentive people, we just said, well, you're going to get your course credit regardless. Actually, after the fact, they had the same opportunity to earn additional money, so that was an IRB requirement. They then reported to a separate room where we conducted the interviews and recorded them, and they either interacted with the interviewer face-to-face, or they were in separate rooms and they interviewed by audio, or they were in separate rooms and they interacted via text chat. So here's the procedures I've just mentioned to you, and keep in mind then, if you were innocent of the theft and you were trying to be credible, you were the people who were telling the truth. And if you were following instructions and you were in the guilty of theft group, then you were going to be deceiving. We used a standardized interview protocol. It included a number of benign questions at the beginning having to do with educational background and work background to get baseline data. And then the interview turned to the theft itself of the wallet from the classroom. And this was set up in a setting where we actually divided the classrooms into multiple rooms. So we had multiple wallets that got stolen over the course of this multi-section course participating in the study. The theft portion concerned the theft itself, and we used a standardized behavioral analysis interview. And then the interviews were under one of three modalities. After the fact, the interviewees reported on whether or not they felt a high level of arousal, degree of negative affect, how hard they tried to control their behavior, whether they thought they were successful. The interviewers also then judged whether the interviewees were truthful and whether there was any deception indicated, and they rated them on credibility. Subsequently, observers would watch a particular interview and get the full audio-visual, or they only got to hear it, so that meant they got the audio and the verbal component, or they simply read the transcript. The same interviews were present across all these conditions. For measurement, this was the most challenging part, and this is why it's taken us quite a while to get to this stage. We had humans doing kinesic coding, but then subsequently we developed automated behavior coding systems to do computer image techniques and get automatic behavior assessments. We analyzed vocal behavior, and we also then did analysis with linguistic behavior. This was done at the time with a tool called Agent 99, and that has then morphed into what's called Splice. Splice differs from Luke in that Luke is a dictionary-based tool. This is more of a part-of-speech tagger and syntactic tool. It includes dictionaries, but it will also calculate a number of things like complexity of the language, diversity of the language, emotiveness, and so on. Okay, to give you a sense of what the automated coding looked like, okay, is this working? No, it's not. There we go. Come on. All right, this is a person in the lying condition, and you can see the automated coding will capture the face and the hands with ellipses and then track the movements. And so we could track things like head position, head velocity, right and left hand position, and so on. Comparatively, here's what the behavior looks like of a more truthful person. And although you can't read the headings on the little red squiggly lines, you might notice just visually that there's quite a difference in the way they behave. So this was the automated coding system. Okay, so to the results, which is the most interesting part. First of all, the participants themselves indicated, and this is the means are all available here for you when you look at the PowerPoint, but I'm not going to go into them. There was a main effect for deception. There was also an interaction with modality, but it didn't override the main effects for deception. The deceivers reported, as we would have expected, higher arousal. They also reported that they experienced more cognitive effort. It was more taxing for them. But they also reported they were higher in motivation, and they exercised more behavioral control. The implications out of their reports were, first of all, they do experience the things that many of us assume go with deception. They experience the greater arousal and effort, but at the same time, they also tried harder to be persuasive and credible. And they also, in the text condition, benefited from the planning and editing potential that text offers them. In terms of what happened with the verbal behaviors, well, first of all, there was a main effect, number of features that were strictly a function of deception. There was more affect-laden language, although if you add it all up, there were fewer positive affect terms. There was more activation language, and I want to show you that result. So you can see here we have low motivation and high motivation, and the deceivers used more intense language than truth tellers, especially under high motivation. There was more non-immediacy. This meant they used more modal verbs, but also contrary to high non-immediacy, they were more temporally immediate, meaning they used more sensory terms related to time. But there was a main effect here on the modal verbs. Those would be words like would, could, should. And what's interesting here is that the main difference had to do with the low motivation condition, where you've got the distinction between truth tellers and deceivers. Under high motivation, there was a strong convergence. Okay, and this is one of the things that begins to surface in this study repeatedly. Go back. Also, deceivers were more uncertain with their language. They used more personalism, that is, more self-reference terms. They used fewer words, which has been, in many analyses, a frequent pattern. Less lexical diversity, and less complex language. Complex meaning syntactic complexity and vocabulary complexity. Fewer multisyllabic words, for example. There was also an interaction with motivation. And so, for example, here again, we get this peculiar effect where the real distinction, the real separation is under low motivation. And in this case, it was the deceivers who were far less redundant than truth tellers. Under high motivation, we get a strong convergence again. So high motivation is not benefiting the deceivers, particularly on verbal measures, contrary to the MIE. There's also some interactions with lexical diversity, with third-person pronouns, and informality in terms of language. I won't go into those details, but there were some effects here. We then conducted a discriminant analysis, and this is a pretty busy chart, but I think the most important thing to pay attention to is that when we did separate classification models, if you went to the text modality, the modal-verb ratio, positive activation, and specificity were the biggest predictors. If you went to the audio modality, a different set of predictors emerged, average word length and temporal immediacy. And in the face-to-face condition, it was, again, a different set of features. This is beginning to tell us that we have to tailor these analyses to the specific conditions we're in. The highest accuracy was detecting face-to-face in the innocent condition, but the accuracy, and that's the red bar to the far right, the yellow right next to it is the face-to-face deception accuracy, rather poor. Okay? And so we're getting different results depending on the modality, and I think this is an important consideration. We also did decision trees. You can look at the results in the PowerPoint. But the basic implications here from the linguistic effects, the combinations of linguistic features distinguish truth tellers from deceivers. We can get some very strong models once we combine a number of features. But they do differ depending on the modality. And the deceivers often approximated the patterns of truth tellers. And that's one of the reasons that we often have detection failures by receivers, because deceivers are not passive, they are strategic, and they're modifying their presentation. Motivation sometimes had more of an impact also on the truth tellers than on the deceivers. So it's a more complex picture. And it suggests to us that contrary to the way some of these other studies have been done, and you'll see this often in the literature, they are often doing a differencing. For instance, a lot of DePaulo's work takes a different score for the same person between when they're being truthful and when they're being deceptive. You lose some extremely important information that way because some of these effects were more on the truth tellers than on the deceivers. And so I want to make a plea that as we move forward, we've got to make our comparisons in relation to the truth tellers. Okay, nonverbal behaviors. These are the ones that are coded by the trained coders. Now, obviously, we couldn't get any nonverbals in the text condition. So this is now limited to either the face-to-face or the audio condition. In terms of vocalics, now, contrary to the fewer words that we found with deceivers, in this case, we've got truth tellers and deceivers looking very similar in terms of the total amount of talk time, at least when they're under low motivation. And actually, with high motivation, it still continues. But notice that the red line is the deceivers. They increase significantly under high motivation. So motivation becomes a strong factor in what we witness if that's all we're measuring. Both deceivers and truth tellers increase their utterance length with high motivation. And the same patterns held if we analyze the talk time percentage, that is the percentage of their total amount of time during the interview, and their mean utterance length. Vocalized pauses and other non-fluencies were only affected, and I want to repeat this, only affected by motivation, not by deception. And that's when we've usually found was also responsive to deception. Okay. Implications. So motivation aids deceivers in becoming more loquacious, although not at the same level as the truth tellers. And contrary to the MIE, motivated deceivers do not suffer disfluent speech more than truth tellers. I think that one's an important finding. Okay, kinesics. Well, we had three basic categories of things we looked at. We looked at illustrator gestures, adapter gestures, those are the ones that are self-touch, and then head movements. And here on the gestures, we have a deception main effect. So, for instance, the total at the far right is deception. The deceivers did less in the way of illustrator gestures. This fits with what we think that truth tellers are going to be more expressive with their hands. In terms of adapter gestures, however, it was a motivation main effect. So deception did not influence this. And then finally, on head movements, same thing. It's only affected by motivation. The conclusion here is deception affects the illustrator gestures, with truth tellers gesturing more. Motivation affected, but deception did not, the amount of head movement and adapters. Now, I want to point out now that because our deceivers are more motivated, there is often, when we're analyzing deception, a confound, because the deceivers that we've assigned to the deceiver condition may be more motivated to begin with. So we don't know if we're actually analyzing a deception effect or a motivation effect. Implications: deception did not interact with motivation. The access to the nonverbal modalities did not afford the receivers more diagnostic clues. Motivation for truth tellers may be misjudged as deceptive. And finally, to repeat, deception is confounded with motivation. All right, how about the automatic tracking? One of the things we did is we tracked a whole lot of features. There are 150 of them. And I won't go into what they are right now, but for instance, A, Q4, RH has to do with something in the right hand in the upper quadrant. And with all these individual features, if you can see the numbers, the correlations are themselves rather small. And that was kind of disheartening. But we combined them into an index. And when we did so, we found that throughout the interview, there was always a gap between the deceivers and the truth tellers. And that there was a lot more difference than one might have suspected by doing this combination of features. Finally, let me very quickly get to, I'm going to skip over the observer results, but here you can see there's quite a number of activities going on, a lot of effects, and time is up. So truth bias, I want to mention, increased monotonically, and that was including more to judging deceivers than truth tellers. And finally, in here we have the interviewer assessments, and one of the things that becomes real evident is that there are a lot of truth biases operating, and that accuracy was heavily influenced by the modality in which judgments were made. And you can read more of this in the final presentation. The final scorecard on those last elements, let's quickly get to those. Deceivers were more successful, that is, they were less transparent in the nonverbal modalities. That's a little contrary to what people have assumed. And for the interviewers, deceivers were most detectable under low motivation text. And observers gave the observers the best shot at being accurate in their detection. So with that, questions?